Hello, my name is Omar Johnson, and for this project, I chose product option 4, which was to create a character-inspired and handcrafted journal from the perspective of one of the characters. So I created two here, but this first one I'm going to talk about is written from the perspective of one of the three modest Negroes Nick and Gatsby encountered while they're in Manhattan. And so this is ultimately just a handwritten journal composed by one of those three African Americans in that limousine to give perspective about this encounter from their point of view. And so the literary elements I chose was point of view, symbolism, and irony, and the criticism lens I chose is African American. So for this project, my initial idea was to create something that brought life to the characters that Fitzgerald dehumanizes in the novel. And so I was hoping to convey a strong message that would shut down those stereotypical depictions of those thriving characters who he describes as two bucks and a girl. And so it just basically gives insight to the truth about Black prosperity in a time where it seemed impossible. And so this perspective helped me to view the novel more so through the time period and also the events associated with it. You know, this was a time where the American dream was prevalent, and I wanted to parallel the experiences of those characters with the condition of society during the time of this novel. And so here in this journal is basically a written record of the encounter by one of the African Americans who I gave the name Edward Spencer. And Edward Spencer is an entrepreneur in the 1920s who built his fortune off of a chain of nightclubs, investing in Black businesses. And this is ultimately to reflect he and his colleagues' perspective of this encounter of meeting Nick and Gatsby. And so as they're riding around Manhattan, you know, they're celebrating, finalizing their purchase of a successful nightclub, and they're riding around to show, you know, we're not just surviving, but we're thriving, saying, look at us, we're here to get used to it. And so they come across Gatsby's Rolls Royce, and they see wealth. They know they have wealth. And so when Nick says they stared at us in haughty rivalry, from the perspective of these African Americans, we see that they turn deliberate in their gaze, not begging, not pleading, but proud that they might be something more than the background that Nick and Gatsby expected. And so they're pretty much saying, yeah, we've got it like that too. So at this point in the novel, Nick looks at them and laughs loud, showing contempt and lack of acknowledgement for these people's success, ultimately getting to show that even if you have big name, big money, nice car, riding around lavishly, if you look like this, you're less. And so we get to see that this scene, you know, the three African Americans, the white chauffeur, the limousine, was something too strange and too unusual for Nick not to laugh at. And so I also gave a little bit of backstory for this journal. It was found in a Harlem brownstone. As you know, this takes place in Harlem, which is a place that Fitzgerald chose to exclude inside the novel. And it was found during a renovation of one of those brownstones that belonged to Spencer. And this forgotten journal was to rather reveals a rare and first-hand glimpse into the Harlem Renaissance, and also a parallel to the portrayal of the American dream and the vibrancy of the Jazz Age and the Great Gatsby. And so for the second product, this one is a journal from the perspective of Gatsby. And so here we see that this is composed by Gatsby, and what he's doing in this journal is pretty much reminiscent of the last time he saw Daisy. And we know he went through all of this trouble in the novel in order to, yes, obtain all the wealth that he had. And so we see that it takes place during the time where he's, you know, building his wealth, trying to track Daisy with his extravagant parties. And so for this product, I chose the psychoanalytic criticism, as well as symbolism, allegory, and perhaps some foreshadowing. And so my initial idea when I made this product was to pretty much give insight into the thoughts of Gatsby, who was at the time was the only one who knew the truth about who he was, where he came from. And so it pretty much shows the process, you know, leading up to the rather before the events in the novel unfold. And so from this perspective, I'm able to sort of feel some sympathy for Gatsby, you know, going through his situation. He wanted Daisy bad, but he couldn't have her because he was too poor. And so he goes through all this trouble, living out every single part of the American dream, but not for the sake of living the American dream. He's doing it for his love for Daisy. And so during this journal, he talks about, you know, how his money is coming. It's big, it's fast. It's not always clean, not always smart, but it's coming. You know, he's learning how to be who he needs to be in order to impress Daisy. And so when we look closely, we can see that it's Gatsby's mansion, the parties, the people, all these things were to attract Daisy. But we see Gatsby here in the window, isolated by himself, which ultimately is to represent the isolation of Gatsby and his purposes of doing all of these things to attract Daisy. But we know that in the end, he comes to a very unfortunate demise and is unable to fulfill the purpose that he was working towards.